Ethan Blackwell's annual charity visit to an orphanage turns his world upside down when a little girl shows him a photograph that reveals a secret daughter he never knew existed. As he searches for the child's missing mother, Grace, he uncovers his brother's deadly web of corporate fraud, murder, and family betrayal that spans decades. Don't forget to subscribe to catch more gripping stories like this one, and let us know in the comments where you're watching from today. The December wind howled outside Willow Haven Orphanage as Ethan Blackwell stepped through its worn wooden doors. At 45, he cut an impressive figure in his tailored black coat. His annual charity visits usually went smoothly. Hand out gifts, take some photos for the press, and leave. But today would change everything. Mr. Blackwell, Mrs. Peterson, the orphanage director, hurried forward. Her grey hair was pulled back in a messy bun, and her sweater had seen better days. "We're so grateful you could make it. The children have been asking about you all week." Ethan managed a polite smile. These visits always stirred up memories. He'd rather forget of his own childhood in a place not much different from this one. Before the hard work, before the millions, before he became the man everyone thought they knew. "The gifts are being brought in now," he said, nodding toward the door where his assistant directed workers, carrying boxes of toys and clothes. The main room was decorated with paper snowflakes and tinsel. Children of all ages sat in groups, their eyes wide as they watched the presents being arranged under a small artificial Christmas tree. Ethan began his usual routine, handing out gifts and exchanging pleasant words with the staff. That's when it happened. "I know you!" A small voice cut through the chatter. A little girl, maybe 6 years old, ran up to him. Her brown curls bounced as she moved, and something about her face made Ethan's chest tighten. "I have a picture of you. My mommy gave it to me before she left." The room went quiet. Mrs. Peterson stepped forward, looking worried. "Amara, honey, don't bother Mr. Blackwell." But Amara was already pulling something from her pocket. It was a photograph, worn and creased from being handled too many times. Ethan's hands shook as he took it. The breath left his body. It was him, 7 years younger, at the garden party he held every summer at his estate. And there, standing next to him, was Grace. Beautiful, kind Grace, with her warm smile and gentle eyes, the same eyes that now looked up at him from Amara's face. "Where?" His voice cracked. He cleared his throat and tried again. "Where did you get this?" "My mommy gave it to me," Amara said again, proud and innocent. "She said to keep it safe. Do you know my mommy?" Mrs. Peterson intervened quickly. "Amara, why don't you go help Miss Sarah with the younger children?" Once Amara had skipped away, she turned to Ethan. "Mr. Blackwell, perhaps we should speak in my office." The walk to her office felt like miles. Ethan's mind raced with memories. He'd locked away years ago. Grace Daniels, the new maid who'd started working at his estate 8 years ago. Their secret meetings in the garden. The way she made him laugh like no one else could. The last time he saw her, tears in her eyes as she handed in her resignation. Mrs. Peterson's office was small and cluttered with files. She closed the door and sat behind her desk, looking uncomfortable. "I assume from your reaction that you knew Grace Daniels?" "Yes," Ethan said, still holding the photograph. "She worked for me 7 years ago." Mrs. Peterson nodded slowly. "Grace brought Amara to us 5 years ago. She was distraught, said she had no choice. Left a small box of keepsakes for Amara. That photograph, some letters, a stuffed bear." She paused. "And a note that said, 'If anything happens to me, keep her safe.'" Ethan's head spun. The timing. It all made terrible sense now. "Did she say where she was going?" "No, she disappeared that night. No forwarding address, no contact information." Mrs. Peterson hesitated. "Mr. Blackwell, Amara's birth certificate lists no father." The implication hung heavy in the air. Ethan stood up abruptly, nearly knocking over his chair. I need to make some calls." "Of course." Mrs. Peterson stood as well. "But Mr. Blackwell, that little girl has been waiting for someone to come for her for 5 years. Whatever you decide to do, please remember that." Back in his car, Ethan loosened his tie, feeling like he couldn't breathe. His driver waited patiently while he pulled out his phone with trembling hands. "Jackson, cancel my meetings for the next week and get me everything you can find on Grace Daniels from 7 years ago. Everything." As the car pulled away from Willow Haven, Ethan looked back at the old building. Through a window he could see Amara playing with the other children. His daughter. He had a daughter. And somewhere out there, Grace was either hiding or worse. The thought chilled him more than the winter wind. What had happened to make her disappear? Why hadn't she told him about the pregnancy? And most importantly, what kind of danger had she been running from? The snow began to fall outside his window as his car headed back to the city. Ethan Blackwell, the man who prided himself on controlling every aspect of his life, felt his carefully constructed world beginning to crumble. But as he looked again at the photograph in his hands, he knew one thing for certain. He had to find Grace. He owed it to Amara. He owed it to Grace. And maybe, just maybe, he owed it to himself. To finally face the past he'd tried so hard to forget. Ethan sat in his home office, staring at the boxes his private investigator had delivered. 3 days had passed since his visit to Willow Haven, and he'd barely slept. The photograph of him and Grace sat on his desk, a constant reminder of what he'd lost and what he might have gained. "Sir?" His assistant Margaret knocked on the door. "Your brother Richard is here to see you." Ethan quickly slipped the photograph into his desk drawer. "Send him in." Richard Blackwell strode into the office like he owned it. At 50, he was 5 years older than Ethan, and never let him forget it. "Little brother, heard you've been canceling meetings. That's not like you." "Something came up," Ethan said carefully. Richard was the only family he had left, but lately something felt off about their relationship. "Personal matter." "Personal?" Richard raised an eyebrow, settling into a leather chair. "You never have personal matters. What's really going on?" Before Ethan could answer, his phone rang. It was Jackson, his investigator. "Excuse me," he told Richard, answering the call. "What did you find?" "Mr. Blackwell, you need to see this." Jackson's voice was urgent. "I tracked down Grace's old friend, Maria Torres. She's working at a diner in Queens. Says she knows what happened the night Grace disappeared." Ethan's heart raced. "I'm on my way." He hung up and stood, grabbing his coat. "Where are you going?" Richard asked, frowning. "We have the board meeting tomorrow." Something more important came up. "Reschedule it." Ethan was already heading for the door. Richard caught his arm. "More important than the company?" "Ethan, you're acting strange. Tell me what's going on. Maybe I can help." For a moment, Ethan almost told him everything, but something held him back. "I'll explain later," he said, pulling away. The Queen's diner was nearly empty when Ethan arrived. A woman in her 30s with tired eyes approached his table. "Maria Torres?" She nodded, glancing nervously around the diner. "You're him, aren't you? The man from the photograph Grace kept?" "Please," Ethan said softly. "Tell me what happened to her." Maria's hands shook as she poured coffee. Grace was so happy when she found out she was pregnant. Scared but happy. "She wanted to tell you, but..." She lowered her voice. "Someone threatened her." "Threatened her? Who?" "I don't know. She wouldn't tell me. But someone powerful. They told her if she ever told you about the baby, they'd destroy both of you. Said they had evidence that could ruin your reputation, crash your company's stock." Ethan felt sick. "Why didn't she come to me for help?" "She tried. The night before she disappeared, she went to your office. But someone was there. Someone. She knew. She ran out terrified, called me in tears." Maria wiped her eyes. "Next day, she brought Amara to the orphanage and vanished. Left me a letter saying she had to disappear to protect everyone she loved." "The letter. Do you still have it?" Maria nodded slowly. "I kept it all these years. Felt wrong to throw it away." She reached into her purse and pulled out an envelope, worn and yellowed with age. Ethan's hands trembled as he opened it. Grace's handwriting was just as he remembered. "Dearest Maria, if you're reading this, I'm already gone. Someone discovered my secret, not just about the baby, but about what I accidentally saw that night at the estate. The missing money, the fake accounts. I can't write it all down, it's too dangerous. But someone very close to Ethan is not who they seem. They'll do anything to keep their secret safe. Take care of yourself. And if you ever see Ethan, tell him I'm sorry. Tell him I never stopped loving him. Grace." Ethan read the letter 3 times, his mind racing. Missing money, fake accounts. He thought back to 7 years ago, when the company's finances had been restructured. Richard had handled everything. His phone buzzed, a text from his assistant. "Mr. Blackwell, your brother is still here. He's asking to see your files. Should I let him?" Suddenly, terrible pieces started falling into place. Richard's strange behavior lately, his increasing control over the company's finances, the way he'd encouraged Ethan to forget about Grace all those years ago. "No," Ethan texted back. "Don't let him touch anything, and call security." He looked up at Maria, who was watching him with worried eyes. "Thank you," he said, standing. "You may have just helped me understand what really happened." As he drove back to his office, Ethan's mind was spinning. If Richard was behind Grace's disappearance, If he'd threatened her to protect himself, then finding Grace wasn't just about reuniting with her anymore. It was about exposing a betrayal that went deeper than he could have imagined. His phone rang again, an unknown number. When he answered, the voice on the other end made his blood run cold. "Mr. Blackwell," a woman whispered, "you don't know me, but I know where Grace is, and she's in danger, real danger. If you want to save her, come alone to the old warehouse on River Street, tonight." The line went dead, leaving Ethan with a choice that could change everything: trust this mysterious caller or risk losing Grace again. As snow began falling over the city, Ethan made his decision. He'd lost Grace once because of fear and hesitation. He wouldn't make the same mistake again, even if it meant walking straight into a trap. The old warehouse on River Street loomed against the night sky. Ethan parked his car a block away, his heart pounding. He'd called his most trusted security guard Tom and told him to wait nearby just in case. "This is crazy," he muttered to himself, checking his phone one last time. No new messages, but there was a missed call from Richard. He ignored it. The warehouse door creaked as he pushed it open. His footsteps echoed on the concrete floor. "Hello, I'm here about Grace. Mr. Blackwell." A woman stepped out of the shadows. She was older, probably in her 60s, with silver hair and dressed in a cleaner's uniform. "Thank you for coming. Who are you?" "My name is Helen Martinez. I've been a cleaning lady at your company for 15 years. She wrung her hands. Nervously, "I knew Grace. We worked together sometimes when she cleaned at your estate." Ethan stepped closer. "You said Grace is in danger. What kind of danger?" Helen looked around fearfully. "Your brother. He's been sending men to look for her. Last week I overheard him on the phone. He said, 'Find her before Ethan does, whatever it takes.' How do you know where Grace is?" "Because I've been helping her hide." Helen pulled out an envelope. "She sends letters sometimes through a friend of a friend, always from different places, never with a return address, but the last one." She handed him the envelope with shaking hands. Ethan opened it carefully. Inside was a short note. "Helen, they found me again. I had to move. Richard's men were asking questions at the diner where I work. I can't keep running. Amara deserves better than this. Maybe it's time to tell Ethan everything. About the money, about what really happened that night. Keep an eye on the news. If anything happens to me, the truth is hidden in the place where we first met. Grace." "When did you get this?" Ethan demanded. 3 days ago. I haven't heard from her since." Helen's eyes filled with tears. "Mr. Blackwell, your brother, he's not who you think he is. 7 years ago, Grace caught him transferring company money into offshore accounts, millions of dollars. When she realized what she'd seen, he threatened her to keep her quiet." Ethan finished, his voice hard. "Not just that. He threatened Amara too. Said he'd make sure Grace lost custody if she ever told anyone." Helen shook her head. "Grace couldn't risk it. That's why she ran." A noise from outside made them both jump. Footsteps. "You need to go," Helen whispered urgently. "There's more you need to know, but not here. Meet me tomorrow at St. Patrick's Church, noon." Ethan grabbed her arm. "Wait, you said the truth is hidden where they first met. Where was that?" "The garden at your estate. Grace told me that's where." The warehouse door burst open. 2 men in dark suits entered, their footsteps heavy. "Go." Helen pushed him toward a back exit. "I'll distract them." Ethan slipped out into the night just as he heard one of the men shout, "Where is he?" He ran to his car, his mind racing. The garden. He had to get to his estate's garden. But first he needed to make sure Helen was safe. He called Tom. "Get to the warehouse. There's an older woman named Helen inside. Make sure she gets home safely." As he drove home, his phone rang again. Richard. This time he answered. "Hello, brother." "Ethan." Richard's voice was smooth as ever. "Where have you been? I'm worried about you." "Are you?" Ethan kept his voice steady. "Or are you worried about what I might find out?" A pause. "I don't know what you mean." "I think you do. Tell me something, Richard. How long have you been stealing from the company?" The silence on the other end was deafening. Finally, Richard spoke, his voice different now, colder. "Come to the office. We need to talk." "No," Ethan said firmly. "I'm going to find Grace, and when I do, it's over for you. Think carefully about what you're doing, little brother." Richard's voice turned threatening. "You have no idea what I'm capable of." "Actually, I'm starting to understand exactly what you're capable of." Ethan gripped the steering wheel tighter. "Stay away from Grace and stay away from my daughter." He hung up before Richard could respond. His hands were shaking, but his mind was clear. He had to get to the garden tonight. Whatever Grace had hidden there 7 years ago, he had to find it before Richard did. The estate was dark when he arrived, but he knew every inch of these grounds. The garden had been Grace's favorite place. They'd spent countless evenings there, talking, laughing. He headed straight for the stone bench where they'd first met. She'd been trimming the roses and he'd stopped to compliment her work. That bench held so many memories. Ethan ran his hands along the aged stone, feeling for anything unusual. There, a loose panel on the side. His fingers found a small package wrapped in waterproof material. Inside was a USB drive and another note. Dear Ethan, if you're reading this, you finally know the truth. Everything Richard did is documented here. The transfers, the threats, the fake accounts. I'm so sorry I couldn't tell you sooner. I thought I was protecting our daughter, but maybe I was just afraid. I love you, I always have. Grace. Tears blurred his vision as he clutched the drive. Finally he had proof, but where was Grace now? Was she safe? And would he find her before Richard's men did? His phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. I saw the men following Helen. She's not safe. Neither are you. Grace left something. Hell's for you, remember the music box? The music box. Ethan's heart skipped a beat. The antique music box he'd given Grace for her birthday, just weeks before she disappeared. But where was it now? The answer hit him like a thunderbolt. There was only one place Grace would have left it, with the person she trusted most to keep. It's safe. Their daughter. Ethan started his car, heading back toward Willow Haven Orphanage. It was late, but this couldn't wait. Every minute that passed put Grace in more danger. And somewhere in that old building, in a little girl's treasured possessions, lay the final piece of the puzzle that could save her mother's life. The lights were still on at Willow Haven when Ethan pulled up. Mrs. Peterson was just leaving, her arms full of paperwork. Mr. Blackwell. She looked startled to see him. It's almost 9 o'clock. I need to see Amara's belongings, he said, trying to catch his breath. The things Grace left for her. Please, it's important. Mrs. Peterson studied his face for a moment, then nodded. Come inside. They walked through the quiet halls. Most of the children were already in bed, but soft whispers and giggles could be heard behind closed doors. Amara keeps her special things in here, Mrs. Peterson said, leading him to a small office. She unlocked a cabinet and pulled out a worn cardboard box. We keep the children's valuable items secure. Ethan's hands trembled as he opened the box. There it was, the antique music box he'd given Grace. It looked exactly the same, its silver surface still gleaming. That arrived about a year after Grace left, Mrs. Peterson said softly. A package with no return address, just instructions to give it to Amara on her 18th birthday. Ethan carefully opened the music box. The familiar melody began to play, Beethoven's Für Elise. But something was different. The mechanism sounded off. He turned the box over, examining it closely. There, a slight gap in the velvet lining. He peeled it back carefully. Hidden underneath was a small notebook and a key. Mr. Blackwell? A small voice made him jump. Amara stood in the doorway, wearing pink pajamas with unicorns on them. Are you looking at my mummy's music box? Ethan's heart clenched. Yes, sweetheart. Is it okay if I look at it? She nodded, coming closer. Sometimes when I can't sleep, Mrs. Peterson lets me listen to the music. She touched the box gently. Mommy said it was special. Your mommy was right. Ethan swallowed hard. Amara, do you remember anything about the day your mom brought you here? Amara's face scrunched up in concentration. She was crying. She said she had to go away to keep me safe, and she said someone would come for me someday. She looked up at him hopefully. Are you that someone? Before Ethan could answer, his phone buzzed. A text from Tom. Helen never made it home. Her apartment's been ransacked. Cold fear gripped his chest. He turned to Mrs. Peterson. Is there somewhere safe Amara can stay? Somewhere not listed in your records? Mrs. Peterson must have seen the fear in his eyes. My sister runs a small farm upstate. No one would think to look there. Good. Take her there now. Don't tell anyone where you're going. He handed her a business card. This is my private number. Call me when you're safe. What's happening? Amara asked, her eyes wide. Ethan knelt down to her level. Your mommy left some very important things here, and some bad people might come looking for them. But I promise you I'm going to find her and make everything okay. You know where my mommy is? Not yet, but I'm getting closer. He hesitated, then pulled out his wallet. Inside was a photo he'd carried for 7 years, him and Grace at the company Christmas party. Would you like to have this? Amara took the photo carefully. She looks happy. She was. Ethan blinked back, tears. And she loves you very much. Mrs. Peterson touched his arm. We should go now, before it gets any later. As they hurried to pack some of Amara's things, Ethan opened the notebook he'd found in the music box. Grace's handwriting filled the pages. "My dearest Amara, there's so much I want to tell you. About your father, a good man who never knew about you because I was too afraid to tell him. About why I had to leave. And about the safe deposit box at First National Bank that holds the truth about everything. The key in this music box opens that box. If you're reading this, find Ethan Blackwell. Show him this notebook. He'll know what to do. I love you more than life itself. Mom." Ethan's phone rang. Richard again. He ignored it. Another text came through. "Brother, you're making this harder than it needs to be. The girl doesn't have to be involved. Let's talk." Ethan's jaw clenched. He quickly texted back, "Touch my daughter and I'll destroy you." "Your daughter?" Richard replied immediately. "So you know. Well, that changes things. Meet me at the office in 1 hour, or Helen won't be the only one who disappears tonight." Ethan looked at the key in his hand, then at Amara, who was putting on her coat. He had a choice to make. The bank wouldn't be open until morning. Helen was in danger now. "Mrs. Peterson, take this." He handed her the notebook and key. "Keep them safe. I'll contact you tomorrow." "Where are you going?" she asked. "To face my brother." He knelt down to hug Amara. "Be good, okay? I'll see you soon." As he watched them drive away, Ethan's phone buzzed one more time. A message from Maria. "Grace called. She's alive, but Richard's men are closing in. She's at the old St. Mary's Hospital. Hurry." Ethan stood in the cold night, torn between two urgent needs: save Helen or find Grace. Either choice could end in tragedy, but as he got into his car, he knew what he had to do. Richard would be expecting him to choose Helen, the obvious threat, the immediate danger. He turned his car toward St. Mary's Hospital. It was time to end this game on his terms. What he didn't know was that someone else was already there, waiting in the shadows. Someone who had been watching everything unfold, and who had plans of their own. St. Mary's Hospital stood abandoned on the outskirts of town, its windows dark and broken. Ethan parked his car behind some overgrown bushes and checked his phone. One last time. 3 missed calls from Richard and a text from Tom. Still no sign of Helen. "Be careful, boss." The front entrance was chained shut, but Ethan found a side door that had been recently forced open. His flashlight beam cut through the darkness, revealing peeling walls and abandoned medical equipment. "Grace?" he called softly, his voice echoing in the empty corridors. A noise from upstairs made him freeze. Footsteps. He climbed the stairs carefully, keeping close to the wall. The second floor was even darker, but he could see a faint light coming from one of the rooms. "Stop! Right there." A woman's voice, familiar but strained. "Don't come any closer." Ethan's heart stopped. "Grace?" She stepped into the beam of his flashlight. 7 years had changed her. Her face was thinner, her hair shorter, but her eyes were the same. Those eyes that he saw every time he looked at Amara. "You shouldn't have come," she said, her voice shaking. "Richard's men—" "I know about everything," Ethan interrupted. "The money he stole, the threats, why you had to run. I found your notes, Grace. I know about Amara." Tears filled her eyes. "I wanted to tell you. Every day I wanted to tell you. Why didn't you trust me?" The pain in his voice was raw. "I would have protected you both." Richard had proof, fake proof, that could have sent you to prison. Documents showing you were involved in his scheme. She wiped her eyes. "He said if I told you about the baby, he'd use them. You'd lose everything, maybe even go to jail. I couldn't let that happen." Suddenly, voices echoed from downstairs, heavy footsteps. "They're here," Grace whispered, terrified. "Richard's men, they followed you." Ethan grabbed her hand. "There has to be another way out. The fire escape, but—" She stopped, her eyes widening at something behind him. "Well, well." Richard's voice made them both spin around. He stood in the doorway, holding a gun. 2 men in dark suits flanked him. "The happy reunion I've been trying to prevent for 7 years. It's over, Richard," Ethan said, stepping in front of Grace. "I have proof of everything you did." Richard laughed. "You mean the USB drive from the garden? Already taken care of. And that safe deposit box Grace thinks is so secure? My men are handling that right now." "What about Helen?" Ethan demanded. "Where is she?" "The cleaning lady. She's fine for now. Cooperative once we explained the situation." Richard smiled coldly. "You see, brother, I've spent years building this. Everything perfectly planned. Did you really think I'd let your little romance ruin it all? It wasn't just the money, was it?" Grace spoke up, her voice stronger now. "Tell him the truth, Richard. Tell him why you really made me disappear." Richard's smile faltered. "Shut up. You were jealous," Grace continued. "You couldn't stand that Ethan had found happiness, that he was going to have a family, because he had everything you'd lost when your wife died." I said, "Shut up." Richard's hand shook as he pointed the gun at her. "Your wife's death wasn't an accident, was it, Richard?" Grace's words hit like bullets. "I saw the papers that night, the insurance policy, the private investigator's report. You killed her for the money, just like you've been stealing from the company." Ethan stared at his brother in horror. "Claire's car accident, that was you. She was going to leave me," Richard shouted, his calm facade cracking. "Take half of everything. I couldn't let her destroy what I'd built. Like you tried to destroy what Ethan and I had?" Grace challenged. "You were nothing," Richard spat. "A maid. You weren't good enough for him, and that child—" His face twisted with disgust. "A dirty secret that would have ruined everything." "That child is my daughter," Ethan said, his voice dangerous. "Your niece. Not for long." Richard steadied his gun. "Once you're both gone, Amara will disappear too. Just another tragic orphan story." Several things happened at once. A police siren wailed in the distance. Grace screamed, "No!" And a new voice rang out from behind Richard. "Drop the gun!" Helen Martinez stood there, Tom beside her, both holding phones, set to record. "It's over, Mr. Blackwell," Helen said firmly. "Everything you just said, your confession about your wife, about the money, about threatening Amara, it's all been streaming live to the police." Richard spun around, but his men were already backing away, not willing to add murder charges to their problems. "You can't prove anything," Richard said, but his voice trembled. "Actually," Tom spoke up, "we can. Helen's been working with the FBI for months, wearing a wire gathering evidence. Tonight was just the final piece they needed." Police sirens grew louder. Red and blue lights began to flash through the broken windows. Richard looked at the gun, in his hand, then at his brother. For a moment, madness flashed in his eyes. "Don't," Ethan warned. "Think about how this ends." The gun wavered. Then, with a cry of rage, Richard turned and ran. He made it 3 steps before Tom tackled him. The gun skidded across the floor as police officers flooded into the room. Grace collapsed into Ethan's arms, sobbing. He held her tight, his own tears falling. "I'm so sorry," she whispered. "I was so scared." "It's over now," he murmured into her hair. "We're going to be okay, all of us." As the police led Richard away in handcuffs, Ethan's phone buzzed. A text from Mrs. Peterson. "We're safe. Amara's asking about you both." Grace looked at the message, fresh tears spilling. "She's really okay?" "She's perfect," Ethan smiled. "She has your eyes and your heart." But their relief was short-lived. One of the FBI agents approached, looking grave. "Mr. Blackwell, Ms. Daniels," he said urgently, "we have a problem. Your brother made some calls before we arrested him. We think someone's going after Amara. The nightmare wasn't over yet, it was just entering its final chapter." "What do you mean someone's going after Amara?" Grace grabbed the FBI agent's arm. "Who?" Agent Sarah Martinez pulled out her phone. "Your brother-in-law made 3 calls before we moved in. One to his lawyer, one to a business partner named James Wilson, and one to someone we haven't identified yet." Ethan's face went pale. "James Wilson? He's Richard's head of security. The man's dangerous, ex-military." "We need to move," Grace said, already heading for the door. "Now!" They raced down the hospital stairs, followed by Tom and 2 FBI agents. Outside, the night had turned stormy, with rain beginning to fall. Mrs. Peterson took her to her sister's farm, Ethan explained as they got into an FBI vehicle. "It's about an hour north." "Call her," Grace urged. "Tell her to get out of there." Ethan dialed, his hands shaking. No answer. He tried again. Still, nothing. "The storm might be affecting cell service up there," Agent Martinez said, but her voice was tense. "How well do you know this farm?" "I've never been there," Ethan admitted. "Mrs. Peterson only told me it was off Route 27. Grace suddenly sat up straight. "Wait, before Richard was arrested, he was looking at his phone. I saw a map open." "He could have sent Wilson the location," Tom said grimly. The FBI vehicle sped through the rain, its sirens wailing. Grace held Ethan's hand so tight it hurt, but he didn't pull away. 7 years of separation, fear, and longing crashed over them like the storm outside. "I should never have left her," Grace whispered. "I thought I was protecting her, but—" "You did protect her," Ethan interrupted firmly. "You kept her safe all these years, and now we'll protect her together." His phone rang, a number he didn't recognize. "Mr. Blackwell." The voice was cold, professional. James Wilson, I assume you know why I'm calling. If you touch my daughter... Let's be professional about this, Wilson cut in. Your brother paid me very well over the years to handle difficult situations. This is just business. Grace grabbed the phone. Listen to me, you monster. If you go anywhere near Amara... Miss Daniels, finally coming out of hiding. Wilson's voice turned mocking. You know, Richard always said you were smarter than you looked. Smart enough to disappear when things got dangerous, but not smart enough to stay gone. Lightning flashed outside as they turned onto Route 27. What do you want? Ethan demanded, taking the phone back. Simple. The evidence you gathered, all of it. The USB drive, the safe deposit box contents, everything. Bring it to the old Miller Bridge in 1 hour, alone. And Amara, prove you have what I want, and I'll tell you where to find her. The line went dead. We're not going to make that trade, Agent Martinez said firmly. We have enough evidence to... He'll kill her, Grace interrupted, her voice breaking. You don't know these people like I do. They don't leave loose ends. Ethan's phone buzzed with a text, a photo. His heart stopped. It showed Amara asleep, in what looked like a car seat. The message read, TikTok. There, Tom pointed through the rain. A mailbox marked Peterson Farm appeared in the headlights. They turned onto a muddy road leading to a darkened farmhouse. 2 other cars were parked outside, Mrs. Peterson's minivan and a black SUV with tinted windows. Wilson's here, Ethan said grimly. Agent Martinez grabbed his arm. Wait, we need to be smart about this. He might not be alone. But Grace was already out of the car, running toward the house. Ethan bolted after her. They reached the porch just as a scream came from inside. Mrs. Peterson's voice. Ethan kicked the door open. The scene inside made his blood freeze. Mrs. Peterson was tied to a chair, her sister unconscious on the floor beside her. James Wilson stood in the center of the room, holding a sleeping Amara in his arms. Behind him, 2 armed men blocked the back door. Right on time, Wilson smiled. Though I did say to come alone. Put her down. Grace's voice shook with rage. The evidence first. Wilson nodded to one of his men, who stepped forward with a laptop. Upload everything you have. Once we verify it's all there, you can have the girl. Outside, they could hear FBI agents moving into position. You're surrounded, Ethan said. There's no way out. Wilson's smile didn't waver. There's always a way out, Mr. Blackwell. The question is how many people have to die before I find it. He shifted Amara in his arms, and her eyes fluttered open. Mommy? She mumbled, still half asleep. Daddy? The world seemed to stop. In that moment of confusion, several things happened at once. Mrs. Peterson, who had been secretly working on her bonds, broke free and lunged at one of the armed men. Tom burst in through a side window, and Grace, with a mother's desperate courage, threw herself at Wilson. Amara tumbled from his arms as chaos erupted. Ethan dove forward, catching her before she hit the ground. Gunshots exploded in the small room. Someone screamed. Through the chaos, Ethan held Amara close, shielding her with his body, but when he looked up, his heart stopped. Grace lay on the floor, blood spreading across her shirt, and Wilson was getting away through the back door, disappearing into the storm. The nightmare wasn't over. It had just turned deadly. Grace! Ethan's voice broke as he handed Amara to Mrs. Peterson and rushed to Grace's side. The bullet had hit her in the shoulder, blood staining her blue sweater. I'm okay, Grace gasped, though her face was pale with pain. Go after him, don't let him get away. FBI agents swarmed the room, securing the scene and calling for medical backup. Agent Martinez knelt beside Grace, pressing a cloth to her wound. Daddy! Amara's small voice cut through the chaos. Is Mommy hurt? Ethan was torn, looking between his daughter's frightened face and Grace's pleading eyes. Go, Agent Martinez commanded. We've got them. Wilson's our last link to Richard's whole operation. We can't lose him. Tom appeared at Ethan's side, rain dripping from his clothes. Boss, I saw which way he went, through the orchard heading toward the river. Ethan squeezed Grace's hand one last time, then kissed Amara's forehead. Stay with Mummy, sweetheart, I'll be right back. The storm had intensified, rain coming down in sheets as Ethan and Tom raced through the apple orchard. Their flashlight, beams bounced off wet tree trunks and low-hanging branches. There, Tom pointed to movement ahead. Wilson was running toward an old covered bridge that crossed the rushing river. Even in the darkness, they could see the water was dangerously high from the storm. Give it up, Wilson, Ethan shouted over the thunder. It's over. Wilson turned, gun raised. Stay back. I still have one more card to play. He pulled out his phone. "One call, Mr. Blackwell, one call to my people, and every piece of evidence against Richard goes public, including the real story about your parents' deaths." Ethan stopped cold. "What are you talking about?" Wilson's laugh was cruel. "You really never wondered why your perfect, loving parents got into their car that night, where they were going in such a hurry?" "They were going to dinner," Ethan said, but uncertainty crept into his voice. "They were going to confront Richard. They'd discovered what he was doing with the company money." Wilson took a step back toward the bridge. Richard couldn't let that happen, so he arranged a little accident. The truth hit Ethan like physical pain. "He killed our parents, too. Your brother's been playing this game a long time, Mr. Blackwell, protecting the family fortune, protecting his position." Wilson's smile was cold. "And I've been helping him clean up his messes for 20 years. "You're lying," Ethan said, but deep down, he knew it was true. All those years, all those suspicious deaths and convenient accidents. "Ask him yourself," Wilson taunted. "Though prison visiting hours can be so inconvenient." Lightning flashed, illuminating the bridge behind Wilson. The river below was a raging torrent. "It's not too late," Wilson continued. "Walk away now, let me disappear, or I release everything, every dirty secret, every crime, every cover-up. The Blackwell name will be destroyed forever." Ethan took a step forward. "You think I care about the family name? About money? My daughter is what matters. Grace is what matters." "Speaking of Grace," Wilson's voice turned menacing, "that bullet that hit her, it was meant for her heart. My men don't usually miss. Think about that before, so you make your next move." Rage filled Ethan's chest. This man had helped kill his parents, had forced Grace into hiding, had threatened Amara. "Tom," Ethan said quietly, "go check on Grace and Amara." "Boss, go. This ends between me and him." Tom hesitated, then disappeared back through the orchard. Wilson raised his gun. "Brave. Stupid but brave. Just like your father was at the end." "You know what your mistake was?" Ethan asked, taking another step forward. "You threatened my family, and you're about to die for them." Wilson aimed, but before he could pull the trigger, a massive bolt of lightning struck a tree at the edge of the bridge. The ancient wood, already weakened by the storm, began to splinter. Wilson stumbled as the bridge shifted beneath his feet. His shot went wild. Ethan charged forward as the bridge groaned and cracked. They collided in a desperate struggle, the gun falling into the churning water below. "You're insane," Wilson shouted as they grappled. "We'll both die." "As long as my family is safe," Ethan growled. The bridge gave another sickening crack. Wilson broke free, trying to run, but the wooden planks were breaking apart beneath them. Ethan grabbed Wilson's jacket as they both fell. The icy river rushed up to meet them. The last thing Ethan heard was Wilson's scream, cut short by the roar of the water. Then darkness took him. Back at the farmhouse, Grace sat propped up on the couch, her shoulder bandaged, holding Amara close. The girl had finally fallen asleep, exhausted by the night's events. "He'll be okay," Mrs. Peterson said softly, bringing Grace some tea. "Ethan's a fighter." Grace stroked Amara's hair, tears falling. "We just found each other again. We can't lose him now." Suddenly, Tom burst through the door, soaking wet. The bridge collapsed. They both went into the river. Agent Martinez was already calling for rescue teams as Grace tried to stand, her wound forgotten in her panic. "Stay with Amara," Mrs. Peterson insisted, pushing her gently back down. But Grace couldn't stay still. Not when Ethan was out there, fighting for their family. Not when their story might end just as it was truly beginning. The storm raged on outside, and somewhere in the darkness, fate would decide if their love was strong enough to survive one final test. The icy water hit Ethan like 1,000 knives. The current pulled him under, tossing him like a rag doll. He fought to reach the surface, his lungs burning. Somewhere in the darkness he heard Wilson's desperate shouts grow fainter, then nothing but the roar of the river. A memory flashed through his mind. Amara's smile, Grace's touch. He couldn't die here. Not now. Not when they were finally whole. His head broke the surface. Through the rain he saw a fallen tree hanging over the water. With the last of his strength, he grabbed a branch. "There!" a voice called from the riverbank. Flashlight beams cut through the darkness. "Mr. Blackwell, hold on!" Rescue workers were scrambling down the muddy slope. A rope flew through the air, landing near his outstretched hand. "Grab the line!" someone shouted. Ethan's fingers were numb, but he managed to wrap the rope around his wrist. They pulled him toward the shore, fighting against the current. As they dragged him onto solid ground, he gasped, "Wilson!" "No sign of him," one of the rescuers said. "The current's too strong. If he went under—" Ethan tried to stand, but his legs gave out. Everything was spinning. "Get him to the ambulance," someone ordered. "He's hypothermic." "No." Ethan struggled against their hands. "Grace, Amara, they're safe," a familiar voice said. Tom appeared beside him, holding an umbrella. "But Grace is worried sick. Let's get you back to them." The ride back to the farmhouse was a blur. Ethan drifted in and out of consciousness, warming blankets wrapped tight around him. He woke to the sound of crying. "Daddy?" Amara's small hand touched his face. "Wake up, Daddy." He opened his eyes. He was lying on the farmhouse couch, surrounded by worried faces. Grace sat beside him, her bandaged shoulder forgotten as she held his hand. "Don't you dare do that to us again," she whispered, tears mixing with the rain on her face. "Never," he promised weakly. Agent Martinez stepped forward. "Mr. Blackwell, I know you need rest, but we need to know. Did Wilson say anything before?" Ethan tried to sit up, memories flooding back. "He confessed about everything, about my parents." Grace gasped. "Your parents? What about them?" "Richard." Ethan's voice broke. "Richard had them killed. Wilson helped cover it up. All these years." The room fell silent. Even the storm outside seemed to quiet for a moment. "I'm so sorry," Grace whispered, holding him. "Closer." Amara climbed onto the couch, squeezing between them. "Don't be sad, Daddy. We're here now." Ethan held his daughter close, breathing in the sweet scent of her hair. She was right. Whatever pain the past held, they were together now. Agent Martinez cleared her throat. "There's something else you should know. While you were occupied with Wilson, we raided Richard's private office, found a safe behind his grandfather's portrait." She pulled out a thick file. "These are the original documents about your parents' accident, about the company fraud, about everything. Wilson was telling the truth about one thing. Richard's been playing this game for a very long time. Will it be enough?" Grace asked. "To keep him in prison? With this evidence, he'll never see the outside of a cell." Agent Martinez's face softened. "It's over, really over." Mrs. Peterson appeared with hot tea and soup. "You both need to rest. Amara can stay in my sister's room tonight." "No." Amara clung tighter to Ethan. "I want to stay with Mommy and Daddy." Grace and Ethan exchanged looks. After everything they'd been through, neither wanted to let her go. "She can stay," Ethan said softly. As the night wore on, the storm began to fade. FBI agents came and went, securing the scene, taking statements. But Ethan barely noticed. His world had narrowed to this couch, to Grace's hand in his, to Amara's steady breathing as she finally fell asleep between them. Tom approached quietly. "Boss, they found Wilson's body, 2 miles downstream." Ethan nodded, feeling no joy in the news, only a deep weariness. Another death in the long chain of tragedy his brother had created. "What happens now?" Grace asked, her head resting on his shoulder. "Now?" Ethan looked at his sleeping daughter, at the woman he'd never stopped loving. "Now we start over, together." But even as he said the words, a shadow crossed Grace's face. "What is it?" he asked. She bit her lip. "There's something I never told you, something I found out just before I had to run. I was going to tell you that night, but then—" "Grace?" Worry crept into his voice. "What is it?" Before she could answer, Amara stirred in her sleep, whimpering. "A nightmare." "Shh, baby," Grace soothed, stroking her hair. "You're safe." Ethan watched them, his heart so full it hurt. Whatever secret Grace was carrying, whatever challenges still lay ahead, they would face them together. But as thunder rumbled in the distance, a final echo of the storm, Grace's words hung in the air like a warning. Their story wasn't quite finished. One last truth remained to be told, and this one might be the hardest to face of all. Morning light crept through the farmhouse windows. Amara still slept peacefully, wrapped in a blanket on the couch. Ethan and Grace sat at the kitchen table, their hands wrapped around steaming coffee mugs. "Tell me," Ethan said softly. "Whatever it is, we'll face it together." Grace stared into her coffee, her hands trembling slightly. "Do you remember Claire, Richard's wife?" "Of course." Ethan's face darkened. "The woman he murdered. She came to see me the day before her accident." Grace's voice was barely a whisper. "She had proof, not just about Richard's financial crimes, but about your parents too. She'd been gathering evidence for months." Ethan leaned forward. "What kind of proof?" "Bank records, photos, a letter your mother wrote, saying she was afraid of Richard." Grace took a shaky breath. "Claire gave me copies of everything. Said If anything happened to her, I should take them to the police. But you didn't. I tried. The night of her accident, I went to the police station, but Richard was there, talking to the chief of police. Tears filled her eyes. He saw me. He knew why I was there. That's when the threat started. Ethan reached across the table, taking her hands. Why didn't you tell me this before? Because of what else Claire told me. Grace finally looked up, her eyes full of pain. About your mother's last visit to the doctor. About what she discovered just days before she died. What are you talking about? So your mother was pregnant, Ethan, 3 months along. Grace's voice broke. Richard didn't just kill your parents that night. He killed your unborn sister, too. The silence that followed was deafening. Ethan's face went pale. A sister? His voice cracked. I never knew. Your mother was going to announce it at dinner that night, the night of the accident. Grace squeezed his hands. Claire found the medical records. That's what finally convinced her Richard was capable of murder. From the living room, they heard Amara stirring. Grace quickly wiped her eyes. There's more, she said hurriedly. The evidence Claire gave me, I hid it. Somewhere Richard would never think to look. Where? In your mother's grave. Grace's voice was steady now. Under the flowers I used to plant there every spring, in a waterproof box. Ethan stared at her. All these years, I couldn't risk Richard finding it, and after I discovered I was pregnant with Amara. She shook her head. I had to protect our baby, but now we can finally prove everything, Ethan finished. Mommy, Daddy. Amara padded into the kitchen, rubbing her eyes. I'm hungry. They quickly composed themselves. Grace got up to make breakfast while Ethan lifted Amara onto his lap. Mrs. Peterson should be back soon, Grace said, pulling out pancake mix. She went to check on her sister at the hospital. Agent Martinez arrived as they were finishing breakfast. She looked tired but satisfied. Richard's being transferred to federal custody today, she announced. But we still need that evidence you mentioned, Mr. Blackwell, to make sure all the charges stick. Ethan and Grace exchanged looks. We need to go to the cemetery, Ethan said. The drive to Oakwood Cemetery was quiet. Amara sat between them. In the back seat of the FBI vehicle, playing with the stuffed bear Grace had left for her at the orphanage. The morning was clear and cold, frost coating the gravestones. Ethan led them to a beautiful marble headstone under an old oak tree. Elizabeth and James Blackwell, he read softly. Beloved parents taken too soon. Grace knelt by the grave, her fingers gently brushing aside dead leaves. Here, under the stone angel. Agent Martinez and another agent helped her lift the small statue. Beneath it was a metal box, green with age but intact. Inside were papers, photographs, and a sealed envelope addressed to Ethan in his mother's handwriting. I never read it, Grace said quietly. It wasn't mine to read. Ethan's hands shook as he opened the envelope. His mother's familiar script filled the page. My dearest Ethan, if you're reading this, something has happened to your father and me. Richard has been stealing from the company for years. At first we couldn't believe it, but the proof became too strong to ignore. Tonight, we're going to confront him. We know it's dangerous, but we have to try to save him from himself. To save our family's legacy. There's something else you need to know. You're going to have a sister. I wanted to tell you in person, to see your face when you heard the news. I hope I still get that chance. If not, remember that we love you. And remember that the truth, no matter how painful, must always come to light. All our love, Mom and Dad. Tears streamed down Ethan's face as he finished reading. Grace held him close while Amara hugged his legs, not understanding but wanting to comfort her father. This is everything we need, Agent Martinez said, examining the other documents. Bank records, photos, transaction histories. Claire did a thorough job, but Ethan barely heard her. His eyes were fixed on his parents' grave, on the words taken too soon. They wanted to save him, he said softly. Even at the end, they were trying to help him. Grace touched the cold marble. They'd be so proud of you, of how you protected Amara, of how you never gave up. Amara looked up at the gravestone. Are these my other grandma and grandpa? Yes, sweetheart. Ethan knelt beside her, and they would have loved you so much. As they stood there, a family united by love and torn apart by secrets, the morning sun broke through the clouds. It caught the crystal angel's wings, sending rainbow light dancing across the grave. But even in this moment of closure, Grace's face held a shadow of worry. There was still one more secret to share, one more truth that could change everything. As they walked back to the car, she squeezed Ethan's hand. There's something else we need to talk about. About Amara. About why. I really had to leave that night. Ethan looked at her, concern crossing his face. What is it? Behind them, Amara skipped ahead with an FBI agent, picking up colorful leaves from the cemetery path. Grace watched their daughter, her heart heavy with the weight of her final confession. Not here, she said softly. Tonight, when we're home. The word home hung in the air between them. After 7 years of running, after all the pain and separation, they finally had a chance at a real home together. If only this last secret didn't have the power to destroy it all. Evening settled over Ethan's mansion as they pulled into the circular driveway. Amara had fallen asleep in the car, exhausted from the emotional day at the cemetery. I'll put her to bed, Grace said softly, lifting their daughter. Then we need to talk. Ethan watched them disappear upstairs, his heart full but anxious. Whatever Grace's final secret was, he could see the fear in her eyes every time she looked at him. In the kitchen, Helen was preparing tea. She'd been released from the hospital that morning, insisting on returning to work despite everything she'd been through. The FBI finished searching Mr. Richards' wing of the house, she reported. They took his computers and files. Agent Martinez said they'll need to question me again tomorrow. Take as much time off as you need, Ethan said. You've done more than enough for this family. Helen smiled, touching his arm. This is where I belong. Besides, someone needs to help Grace and Amara settle in. Grace appeared in the doorway. She's asleep, still holding that bear I left her at Willow Haven. Helen, would you? Ethan gestured upstairs. Of course, I'll keep an ear out for Amara. She squeezed Grace's hand as she passed. Welcome home, dear. Alone in the kitchen, Grace's composure began to crack. She wrapped her arms around herself, tears falling. Grace? Ethan stepped toward her. Whatever it is, I was pregnant with twins, she burst out. That night when I ran, I was carrying twins. Ethan froze. What? Amara had a brother. Grace's voice broke. Jacob. He was smaller, weaker. The doctors said she couldn't continue. Ethan guided her to a chair, his heart pounding. Tell me. The stress, the running, living in fear, but it was too much. Grace's whole body shook, with sobs. He was born too early, 3 months early. He lived for 2 days. Oh, God. Ethan pulled her into his arms. Why didn't you tell me? I couldn't. Richard was watching the hospitals. If he'd found out about the twins. She clutched Ethan's shirt. I buried our son alone in a small cemetery in Ohio under a false name. I couldn't even put flowers on his grave in case someone traced them back to me. Ethan's tears fell into her hair. A son, a tiny boy he'd never known, never held. I visit him every year on his birthday, Grace whispered. Leave toy cars and little planes. He's buried under a maple tree. The leaves turn so beautiful in fall. Take me there, Ethan said hoarsely. Tomorrow, we'll go together. Grace looked up at him, her eyes full of fear and hope. You don't hate me for keeping him from you? Hate you? Ethan cupped her face in his hands. You protected our children with everything you had. You carried that pain alone for 7 years. You're the strongest person I've ever known. I see him in Amara sometimes, Grace said softly. They had the same eyes, the same smile. I've wanted to tell her about her brother, but we'll tell her together when she's ready. Ethan kissed her forehead. No more secrets, no more running. We're a family now. From upstairs came the sound of small feet padding down the hall. Mommy, Daddy. Amara appeared in her unicorn pajamas, clutching her bear. I had a bad dream. They quickly wiped their eyes as she climbed into their laps. Want to hear a story? Grace asked, her voice steadying. About what? About a brave little girl and her very special guardian angel, a brother who watches over her from heaven. Amara snuggled closer. Is it a true story? Yes, sweetheart. Ethan's voice was thick with emotion. It's our story, our family's story. As Grace began to tell their daughter about the brother she never knew, Ethan held them both close. Outside, the first snow of winter began to fall, covering the garden, where he and Grace had first met. 7 years of pain and separation had led to this moment. Richard was in prison, facing justice for all his crimes. Their parents' murders had finally been solved, and most importantly, they were together, not perfect, not unmarked by loss, but whole in a way that only love and truth could make them. 6 months later, they stood in that small Ohio cemetery. Amara placed a toy airplane next to her brother's headstone, which now bore his true name, Jacob Blackwell, beloved son and brother. Look, Mommy, she pointed up. A butterfly, is that Jacob saying hello? Yes, baby. Grace smiled through her tears. He's always with us. Ethan wrapped his arms around his family, watching the butterfly dance against the blue sky. In his pocket was an envelope, the deed to Willow Haven Orphanage, now funded permanently by the Blackwell Foundation. A place where other children would find their way home. "Ready?" he asked softly. Grace nodded, taking Amara's hand. "Let's go home." As they walked away, the butterfly followed, its wings catching the sunlight like a promise kept, a family restored, a love that had survived every storm. And in the end, that was all that mattered. Vantjend.